It was a cold morning at Arlington National Cemetery. The air was calm, the kind of silence that carries both peace and pain. The sky was pale gray, and the sun tried to peek through the thin clouds. Rows of white marble headstones stretched far across the green hills, each one marking a life, a story, a sacrifice. The grass was wet with morning dew, and a light breeze moved through the trees, whispering softly as if the wind itself was paying respect. That morning was special. It was Veterans Day, a day when people came together to honor those who had served the nation. Families, children, veterans, and tourists had gathered near the tomb of the unknown soldier. The ceremony there was always sacred, precise, quiet, and filled with deep emotion. Every sound, every movement mattered. Among the crowd stood Colonel James Porter, a tall man in his early 60s. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his medals shining faintly under the gray sky. But there was something different about his expression. He did not look proud or proud-hearted. His face carried a mixture of dignity and sorrow. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, revealed a story that words could not tell. James had served in the Army for more than 25 years. He had seen places many could only imagine: deserts, mountains, and battlefields. He had been awarded the Bronze Star Medal, one of the nation's highest honors for bravery. That medal was given to soldiers who had shown courage and dedication beyond the call of duty. But for James, the medal was not just a symbol of bravery. It was a reminder of days that could never return and of people who never made it home. As the crowd settled into silence, the Old Guard, known officially as the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, began their ceremonial march. Their movements were exact and steady. Each step landed at the same rhythm, their faces emotionless yet full of purpose. The soldiers guarding the tomb had one of the most honorable duties in the military: to protect and respect the resting place of unknown heroes day and night, no matter the weather, no matter the time. They never failed. The sound of the rifle clicks echoed softly as the guards changed shift. The audience watched with full attention. Children whispered to their parents, asking quiet questions, while older veterans stood silently, some with hands over their hearts, some wiping away a tear. It was a sight that stirred every soul. Colonel James Porter stood near the front row, invited as a guest of honor. The announcer spoke through a clear microphone, telling the crowd about his long service and his act of bravery overseas. People clapped politely, some with admiration, others with gratitude. James nodded slightly but didn't smile. He held something in his right hand, a small box that contained his bronze star. His fingers tightened around it, as if he was holding not a medal, but a memory. The announcer's voice continued. Today, we honor Colonel James Porter, a true patriot who risked his life to protect his fellow soldiers. His courage and leadership in the field serve as an example to all Americans. Everyone turned their eyes to him. The cameras flashed, reporters lifted their lenses, and a few veterans saluted him. But James didn't lift his head right away. He took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the tomb of the unknown soldier, where the guard's steady steps continued, left, right, like the heartbeat of the place. Then, something stirred inside him. He remembered faces. His friends, his comrades, men who had laughed with him, marched with him, shared meals with him. Some of those faces had disappeared forever in the smoke of war. The medal in his hand suddenly felt heavier than ever. It wasn't shining now. It felt cold. He thought about how many men had deserved this medal far more than he did, men who never came home to receive it. The announcer finished speaking, and the sound of the bugle filled the air. The tune of taps floated gently through the crowd, soft and sorrowful. The people bowed their heads. For a few long moments, there was only music and silence, two things that always spoke louder than words. When the song ended, James slowly stepped forward. Everyone thought he was going to place a wreath or salute the tomb. But he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket and took out the small bronze medal. The sunlight caught it just right, making it gleam for a brief second before the light faded again. The crowd watched, puzzled. No one expected what he was about to do. He looked at the medal for a moment, as if seeing not the medal itself, but all the memories it carried, the laughter, the fear, the long nights under foreign skies. Then he looked up toward the tomb. His heart felt heavy but clear. He walked a few steps closer, his boots clicking softly on the marble. Every eye followed him. Even the guards, known for their unbroken discipline, seemed to notice the movement. A young boy in the crowd whispered to his mother, "What is he doing?" The mother shook her head quietly, unsure. James stopped a few feet from the tomb. The air felt colder now. He held the bronze star out in front of him, his hand trembling slightly. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, he bent down and placed it gently on the ground near the marble steps of the tomb. He rested it there carefully, almost lovingly, as if placing a flower on a grave. His head bowed low, and his lips moved silently in prayer. The crowd gasped softly. No one spoke. Cameras stopped clicking. The sound of the guards' footsteps echoed louder than before. Everyone understood that something meaningful, something rare, was happening right before their eyes. For James, time seemed to stop. He wasn't thinking about medals or honors anymore. He was thinking about the people the tomb represented, the unknown, the forgotten, the brave. He was thinking about how honor wasn't something to be worn but something to be shared, and maybe in that moment he wanted to share his honor with those who could no longer receive theirs. He stood back up slowly. His eyes glistened, but he didn't wipe the tears away. He turned to the crowd who were still frozen in silence. For a brief moment he met the eyes of one of the tomb guards, a young man standing tall and motionless under his shining helmet. There was something in that look, something powerful and wordless. Respect, understanding, brotherhood. Then James stepped back, saluted the tomb, and returned to his place among the crowd. The silence continued for several seconds. No one moved. It felt as if the air itself held its breath. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap softly. The sound grew slowly, carefully as more people joined. But James didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the tomb, his heart steady, his mind at peace. The ceremony continued, but the mood had changed. People whispered quietly, trying to understand the meaning behind what they had seen. Some thought he was giving up his medal out of guilt. Others felt he was honoring someone lost. But deep down, many sensed that what he had done came from something pure, a deep sense of gratitude and humility. As the morning light grew stronger, and the ceremony neared its end, James stood silently among the crowd. He had not planned any of it. He hadn't written a speech or prepared a moment of attention. It had simply come from his heart, an act born from the quiet truth that real honor doesn't come from medals, but from memory and meaning. And though no one said it out loud, everyone there that day felt it. Something powerful had just taken place. Something that would not be forgotten. The crowd remained silent after Colonel James Porter placed his bronze star on the marble steps. No one knew what to say or do. The air felt heavy, as if time itself had paused to honor the moment. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood quietly, the marble glowing faintly in the gray light. The guard continued his slow, perfect march, each step measured, each turn sharp, every motion precise. It was a dance of discipline and respect that had been repeated for decades, yet on this day, it felt different. James stepped back into the crowd, his hands at his sides. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but he didn't care. He hadn't done it for attention. He had done it for something deeper, something that words could not describe. Still, he knew that people were confused. He could see it on their faces, surprise, curiosity, even awe. Some whispered to one another, wondering what had just happened. A few steps away, an old veteran with a cane leaned toward his wife and said softly, "That man, he just left his medal. Why would anyone do that?" His wife, with teary eyes, replied, "Maybe it's not what we think. Maybe it means something only he can understand." The announcer, who had been standing near the microphone, didn't speak for a moment. Even he seemed unsure how to continue. The program had a list of names and speeches, but right now no one wanted to break the silence. The moment had a weight that demanded respect. James stood quietly watching the tomb guard. The soldier's movements never stopped. Back and forth, step by step. His shoes clicked softly against the stone path. The rhythm was calming, but steady like a heartbeat. James found comfort in that sound. It reminded him of the consistency of duty, how some people carried on their work no matter what happened around them. Then something subtle changed. As the guard reached the end of his path, he turned and paused for half a second longer than usual. It was barely noticeable, but those who were watching closely saw it. The young guard's head turned slightly toward where James had left the medal. He didn't break formation, but his eyes flickered down to the small bronze star resting on the marble. That single glance spoke volumes. It was as if he understood the meaning behind the act. The guard continued his march, but the air was no longer the same. The crowd was watching both men now, the decorated veteran who had laid down his medal, and the silent soldier who guarded the tomb. The space between them felt filled with something powerful. A quiet conversation made not of words, but of respect. A small boy standing in the front row tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "why did that man put his medal down?" The father bent down and replied softly, "Maybe he wanted to give it to the ones who can't come back. Sometimes, son, heroes honor other heroes." The boy looked thoughtful. His young eyes stayed fixed on the bronze star, glinting faintly on the cold stone. It was small, but in that moment it seemed brighter than anything else around. Meanwhile, James stood with his hands behind his back, his mind drifting to the past. The wind felt colder now, brushing softly against his face. He thought of the men from his unit, the laughter, the stories, the long nights under the stars in distant lands. He could almost hear their voices again, faint but familiar. He remembered how they used to tease him for being too serious, how they sang songs during quiet nights just to keep their spirits alive. Most of those voices were gone now. The medal he had placed on the ground represented them more than himself. One of the organizers walked up slowly, her heels clicking lightly against the pavement. She was nervous, unsure if she should approach him. Her name was Lisa, a young woman who had been helping coordinate the event for weeks. She spoke softly, trying not to break the peaceful air. "Colonel Porter," she said quietly, "are you sure you want to leave your medal there? We can bring it back for you." James turned his head slightly and gave her a kind smile. "No," he said simply. "It belongs there now." Lisa nodded, her eyes full of emotion. She didn't ask again. She just stepped back, understanding that some actions don't need explanations. They simply speak for themselves. Minutes passed and the ceremony slowly resumed. A speaker took the stage, his voice calm and respectful as he read the names of fallen heroes. The wind carried his words across the field. But even as the speeches continued, most people couldn't take their eyes off that small bronze medal lying near the tomb. It felt like it had become part of the ceremony, part of the story of the day. As the last few names were read, something extraordinary happened. The tomb guard came to a stop. His boots clicked together as he faced the crowd. He raised his rifle and saluted, marking the end of the shift. The relief guard approached from the far side, marching with precision. The crowd watched in silence as they performed their practiced exchange, the changing of the guard. Every step was measured, every motion exact. But this time, when the new guard took his place, something unexpected occurred. The outgoing guard, the one who had been watching the medal, broke the usual rhythm. Instead of marching away immediately, he paused for a brief second beside the steps where the bronze star rested. It wasn't part of the routine, but he couldn't ignore what had been left there. The medal seemed to speak to him, silently asking for acknowledgement. The guard looked straight ahead, but his posture softened just a little. Then, in a quiet, respectful motion, he lowered his hand and saluted the medal. The gesture was small, but everyone saw it. It wasn't in the manual, and it wasn't part of the ceremony. Yet it was perfect. It was real. A hush swept over the crowd. Cameras clicked softly. Some people covered their mouths in surprise. Even the announcer, who had seen hundreds of ceremonies, froze in awe. What they were witnessing was something sacred, a bond between two soldiers, one retired and one serving, joined by honor and understanding. James saw the salute. His heart filled with emotion he couldn't hide. His eyes grew wet, but he didn't look away. The young guard's gesture had spoken louder than any medal or speech ever could. It was a moment of connection, between generations, between stories, between lives devoted to something greater than themselves. The guard finished his salute, turned sharply and marched off, every movement full of purpose. The new guard began his watch, his steps echoing once again in steady rhythm. The bronze star remained on the marble, untouched, shining gently under the soft morning light. When the ceremony ended, people began to leave slowly, still whispering about what they had seen. Reporters tried to capture photos, but many of them lowered their cameras halfway through. They realized that this was not a moment for headlines. It was something that deserved quiet respect. An elderly woman stopped James as he walked toward the exit. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to him. "Sir," she said gently, "that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. My husband served too. He never came home. Thank you for remembering them." James smiled faintly and nodded. "We never forget," he said softly. "Not those who gave everything." She squeezed his hand once, tears filling her eyes, then walked away. Around them, people continued to speak in hushed voices, their hearts moved by what they had witnessed. The medal, the silence, the salute, everything had blended into a moment that would stay with them forever. As James left the grounds, he turned one last time to look back. From where he stood, he could see the white marble of the tomb glowing faintly under the afternoon sun. The guard's steady march continued, a timeless rhythm that would never stop. And there, just at the edge of the steps, the small bronze star still rested, a simple object carrying a powerful message. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "They'll know now. They'll all know." His voice was quiet, carried away by the wind. For the first time in years, his heart felt light. The medal was no longer his burden to carry. It had found its rightful place. And as he walked away from the cemetery gates, he knew that something had changed. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been there that day. The crowd was still whispering when the young tomb guard, Sergeant Michael Rivers, returned to his post after the change of guard. His face was calm, his steps perfect, but inside something in him was stirring. He had performed this ceremony hundreds of times before. Every movement, every second of his watch was carefully trained, almost mechanical. But today felt different. Something had touched his heart in a way he hadn't expected. The image of that bronze star resting on the marble steps stayed in his mind. It wasn't just a medal to him. It was a symbol of everything he had ever believed about service, duty, and sacrifice. He had seen veterans visit the tomb before. Many saluted, some cried quietly, others left flowers or flags. But what Colonel James Porter had done was something he had never seen. It wasn't about pride. It was about humility, a gesture that spoke louder than any speech ever could. As Michael marched in his slow, steady rhythm, his mind went back to the words that had been drilled into him during training. "We are the guardians of honor. We do not speak. We do not break formation. We represent those who cannot." Those rules had guided every step he had taken. But now, watching that medal lying there, he felt a pull inside him, a call from something beyond the rules. It wasn't rebellion. It was respect. A few feet away, the crowd was starting to thin. Some people were leaving, their footsteps soft against the stone walkway, but a smaller group stayed, unable to walk away from what they had just witnessed. They wanted to see what would happen next. The wind carried a light chill, and the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a faint glow over the tomb. Michael continued to march. Left, right, left. His rifle balanced perfectly on his shoulder, his eyes straight ahead. But each time he passed the steps, his gaze flickered slightly toward the medal. He noticed how it gleamed faintly against the marble, a tiny glint of bronze that seemed almost alive in the morning light. It felt wrong to leave it lying there, but it also felt wrong to move it without meaning. He could sense that this was not an ordinary object anymore. It carried the weight of sacrifice and love. Finally, when the next scheduled pause came, the exact moment when the guard faces the tomb and salutes, Michael made a choice. He came to a halt, standing tall and proud, the wind brushing softly against his uniform. For a second, the entire cemetery seemed to fall silent again. Even the birds paused their song. He looked straight at the tomb, then slowly lowered his eyes to the small bronze medal at his feet. The audience noticed the slight change in his focus. Some held their breath. The cameras that were still recording zoomed in, unsure what they were about to capture. Then, in a motion that broke every expectation but not a single ounce of respect, Michael took one careful step forward. The crowd gasped softly. Tomb guards never broke formation. It was one of the strictest traditions in the military. But Michael's face was calm, and his movements carried the grace of someone acting from pure purpose. He marched toward the medal, stopped exactly in front of it, and lowered his rifle to his side. Every motion was controlled, deliberate, filled with respect. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the medal. The reflection of the sky danced faintly across its surface. Then he did something no one had seen before in all the years of ceremonies at Arlington. He slowly removed the white glove from his right hand and knelt down beside the medal. The crowd went utterly still. Even the flag above the tomb seemed to hang motionless in the air. Gently, with his bare hand, he picked up the bronze star. He held it carefully, as if it were made of glass. The metal was cold, but it felt alive in his palm. He turned it slightly, reading the engraving. "For bravery and service beyond duty." His throat tightened. For a moment he forgot the crowd, the cameras, even the ceremony. All he could think about was what that medal meant. Not the award itself, but the story behind it. The courage, the pain, the loss, the love for country and for brothers in arms. Then he stood, tall and proud, holding the medal firmly but gently in his hand. He turned to face the crowd. His eyes found Colonel James Porter, who stood silently near the front row, watching with tears gathering in his eyes. The two men locked eyes for just a moment. One young, one old, two soldiers bound by the same unspoken truth. Michael stepped forward, his movements measured and strong. The crowd parted slightly as he approached James. Every step echoed in the cold air, a rhythm of honor that filled every heart watching. When he reached James, he stopped, stood straight, and lifted the medal between them. The crowd could see his expression, not pride, not defiance, but deep respect. For the first time that day, a voice broke the sacred silence of the tomb. It was Michael's voice, calm and steady, yet filled with emotion. "Sir," he said, his tone respectful and clear. "Heroes don't leave honor behind, they share it." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of history. The entire crowd felt them like a wave washing through their hearts. There were no cheers, no noise, just stillness and emotion. James's lips trembled as he looked at the young guard before him. Slowly, Michael extended his hand, returning the bronze star to him. James stared at it for a moment, then looked back at Michael. His voice cracked slightly as he said softly, "Thank you, son, but today it doesn't belong to me alone." Michael nodded once. Without another word, he saluted sharply, a salute full of pride, respect, and unity. James returned the salute, his hand shaking slightly. Around them, people began to stand taller, many wiping their eyes. It wasn't sadness they felt, it was something higher. It was the kind of feeling that reminds you of what honor truly means. Michael placed the medal back into James's palm, then stepped back into position. He turned sharply, marched back toward the tomb, and resumed his watch as if nothing had happened. But everyone there knew that something unforgettable had just taken place. The crowd erupted, not with loud cheering, but with a wave of gentle applause. It started softly, almost like a whisper, then grew into a heartfelt rhythm that filled the air. Even those who didn't understand military traditions knew they had witnessed something sacred, a bridge between generations, between those who served and those who still stood guard. James held the medal close to his chest. He didn't put it back in its box. Instead, he looked at it with new eyes. It no longer felt heavy. It no longer carried guilt or grief. It carried something different now. Understanding. The act of that young guard had given it new meaning. The medal was not just his. It was a shared symbol of courage, honor, and gratitude. As the applause faded, the announcer finally found his voice again. His tone was quiet, almost trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you've just witnessed was not planned, not rehearsed, but it may be one of the most powerful moments ever seen at Arlington." The audience nodded silently. Some clasped their hands together. Others simply stood still, their eyes glistening. In that moment, there were no ranks, no titles, no differences, only unity. The tomb guard's footsteps began again. Left, right, left, echoing through the quiet cemetery. The sound was steady, proud, eternal. James took one last look at the tomb, then bowed his head slightly in respect. He felt at peace, truly at peace, for the first time in years. When he finally turned to leave, a young boy who had been watching with his father ran up to him. "Sir," the boy said shyly, "was that your medal?" James smiled gently and knelt so that he was at the boy's level. "It's everyone's medal now," he said. "It belongs to all who gave their best." The boy nodded, smiling brightly. James patted his shoulder and stood up. As he walked away, he looked back one last time. The guard continued his steady march. The medal had been returned to his hand, but its message would stay there, on those steps, in that sacred space, forever. The sun had broken fully through the clouds now, lighting up the white marble of the tomb and the endless rows of headstones beyond. It was a simple scene, quiet, peaceful, and perfect. But for those who had witnessed it, that day would be remembered as something extraordinary, a moment when a simple act of respect reminded everyone that real honor lives not in medals, but in the hearts of those who serve and remember. The ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery had ended, but the quiet lingered. People were leaving slowly, as if no one wanted to break the solemn moment they had just witnessed. The crowd's movement was gentle, respectful. Conversations were soft, almost whispers, and many stayed behind to look at the tomb of the unknown soldier one last time. Colonel James Porter remained in place for several moments after stepping back from Sergeant Rivers. His eyes stayed fixed on the small bronze medal he still held. It seemed lighter now. The medal had lost its burden and gained something far greater, a meaning that went beyond service or recognition. The medal represented sacrifice, but also humility. It was not just James's story anymore. It belonged to every soldier who had given their all. That moment had made him understand something important. Honor was not something one wore. Honor was something one passed on. The people around him began to move, but James stayed. Veterans, families, reporters, and even some tourists approached quietly, drawn by the energy of what had happened. They looked toward the tomb and toward James. They whispered to one another, trying to make sense of it. Lisa, the ceremony organizer, approached again. She moved softly, her steps careful so as not to disturb the moment. She came beside James and spoke in a quiet voice. "Colonel, people are still talking about what happened. You changed something here today." James nodded, still staring at the medal. "I didn't plan it," he said softly. "It just happened." "I thought about the men who never came home, the ones whose names we will never know. This medal, it belongs to them." Lisa studied him for a moment. "And the guard? Sergeant Rivers?" she asked. "He did something remarkable, too." James smiled faintly. He understood without words. That's why it mattered. Around them, some people were leaving, but a group of veterans stayed. They had been watching silently, some with tears in their eyes. A few approached James with quiet nods of respect. One older man wearing a faded uniform and a worn cap stepped forward. "Colonel," he said softly, "I've been coming here for years. I've seen many ceremonies, but never something like this. You reminded us all what this place really means." James looked at him and gave a small nod. "That's all I wanted," he said. As the crowd dispersed, Sergeant Rivers remained at his post. He did not move or speak, yet there was a change in him. His shoulders seemed a little taller, his step steadier. For him, this day was not just part of duty. It had become something personal, a memory he would carry for the rest of his life. Later, far away from the marble steps, James found a quiet spot to sit. He still held the medal in his hand. It was warm from the touch of many hands and the soft light of the day. He remembered the faces of the soldiers he had served with, young faces filled with courage, laughter, and dreams. Many of them had died in silence, far from home. The medal was not just for him. It was for them, too. The sound of footsteps brought him out of his thoughts. Sergeant Rivers approached quietly, standing a few feet away. His uniform was crisp, his helmet polished. He did not smile, but there was respect in his eyes. "Colonel," he said, his voice low but firm, "that was something none of us expected today. You gave meaning to this medal, and you reminded us why we stand guard here." James looked up at him. "You gave meaning back to it, too. Without what you did, it wouldn't have been complete." The two men stood silently, the noise of the departing crowd fading. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang softly. It was a quiet moment, one without words but full of understanding. Finally, James spoke again. "I want people to remember this day, not because of me, but because of what it stands for. Honor is not about medals or recognition. It is about remembering those who gave their all." Sergeant Rivers nodded. That's why I acted. That medal wasn't just for you, sir. It was for all of us. It belongs to everyone who has stood in service." James smiled faintly. "Then we've done something right today." They stood together for a moment longer, watching the tomb. The white marble glowed softly in the afternoon light, the rows of headstones stretching out behind it like a silent sea of history. The crowd had gone now, but the sense of unity lingered. Later, news crews began to arrive. The small moment at the tomb had not stayed quiet for long. Videos of the medal and the guard's salute were already being shared across phones, social media, and news channels. It was spreading quickly, not as a story of ceremony, but as a story of honor. Journalists began to approach James. "Colonel, can you explain why you left the medal there?" one reporter asked. James shook his head gently. "It's not about explanation," he said. "It's about meaning. That medal belongs to the memory of every soldier who gave everything. I wanted to show that. Sergeant Rivers helped me do that." The reporter nodded, sensing there was something deeper than words could capture. Around them, other veterans approached, shaking James's hand or placing a hand gently on his shoulder. No one spoke much, but the respect in their eyes said everything. By evening, the story had begun to spread beyond Arlington. People began talking about the moment in cafes and homes and classrooms. Veterans groups shared it widely, describing it as one of the most moving acts they had ever witnessed. Social media buzzed with photos and videos of the ceremony, the medal, and the guard's salute. Many called it a moment of pure honor. James and Sergeant Rivers were invited to speak about it, but neither of them sought attention. For them, the day was not about recognition. It was about a message. The medal had been a symbol, but the real meaning was something far greater. That night, Arlington was quiet. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood still under the stars, guarded by soldiers who never rest. Somewhere nearby, the small bronze medal rested quietly. It had been returned to James's hand, but its meaning had spread far beyond him. It had touched every person who had witnessed the moment. In the days that followed, veterans and civilians alike reflected on what had happened. Some wrote letters to newspapers. Others told the story to their friends and families. The medal itself became a symbol of something greater, a reminder that honor is not something you wear alone. It is something you carry together. For James, the memory of that morning stayed with him. Every time he thought of it, he remembered the face of Sergeant Rivers, standing silent but strong. He remembered the hush of the crowd, the glimmer of the medal in the light, and the quiet strength of the tomb. Most of all, he remembered the truth that had become clear to him that day, that honor is not earned for oneself, but shared for all. For Sergeant Rivers, the moment became part of his own story. He returned to his watch, but he carried more than discipline with him now. He carried a lesson, that respect sometimes requires breaking routine, and that courage is not just about action in battle, but also about what you do in moments of meaning. In the weeks that followed, Arlington visitors continued to talk about what they had seen. Teachers told students, veterans told new recruits, families told their children, and at the center of it all was the simple truth that both men had shown without words, that the deepest meaning of service lies in humility, remembrance, and honor shared. The story spread quietly at first, then widely. It was not about medals or ceremonies. It was about the human heart. It was about how a single moment, a single choice, could change the meaning of something forever. And for everyone who had been there, part 4 of this story was not the end. It was the beginning of something far greater. The days after the ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery were quiet for Colonel James Porter, but the world around him was not. What had happened on that cold Veterans Day morning was already spreading far beyond the marble steps, where the bronze star had been placed. Videos taken by onlookers, quiet conversations among visitors, and social media posts had begun to turn the simple moment into something extraordinary. James kept his own thoughts private. He returned to his home, spending hours reflecting. The medal rested in a small wooden box on his desk. It was no longer simply a medal of honor. It had become a symbol of sacrifice, of humility, of something much deeper than a ceremony could ever express. Every time James looked at the medal, he thought of the young tomb guard who had acted without hesitation, Sergeant Michael Rivers. He thought about the look in the sergeant's eyes that morning, the salute that no training would have prepared him to give, the quiet but powerful words spoken. Heroes don't leave honor behind, they share it. Those words stayed with James. They became more than words. They became a truth he wanted to carry forward. Meanwhile, Sergeant Rivers continued his duty at Arlington. Every day as he stood guard, he felt the weight of what had happened. Guards before him had stood silent in discipline, but he now stood in a deeper understanding of service. He knew that what he had done that morning was more than breaking ceremony. It was a choice to honor something beyond tradition, the memory of every soldier who had given their life for their country. As weeks passed, Arlington began to receive letters and messages from people touched by the moment. Veterans, families of soldiers, school teachers, and students wrote about the ceremony. Many said it had changed the way they thought about honor. Some told stories of their own loved ones who had served quietly, without recognition. Others wrote about the courage of James and Michael, and how it had inspired them to reflect on their own service and sacrifices. James received dozens of letters. He kept each one carefully. They were not letters seeking his praise. They were letters of gratitude. Some were short, simply saying thank you. Others were longer, telling personal stories of bravery, loss, and remembrance. They all shared one thing in common. They had been moved by what had happened. One day, a teacher from a nearby school wrote to James and invited him to speak to her students about the meaning of the day. James accepted. It was not for attention, but because he wanted to share what he had learned. The classroom was filled with young faces, students who had never served in the military and yet listened with quiet attention. James told them about his own years of service, about the meaning of the Bronze Star, and about why he had left it at the tomb. He spoke softly, but with strength. It was never about keeping the medal, he said. It was about remembering those who could not stand beside us today. That day at Arlington, I learned something important, that honor is not about pride alone. It is about humility. It is about sharing the respect we carry for those who gave everything. The students listened intently, some nodding quietly. A few raised their hands to ask questions, about the tomb, about the soldiers, about the meaning of service. James answered simply, always returning to the same idea. Honor is shared, and respect is remembered. Meanwhile, Sergeant Rivers continued to stand at the tomb. Every time his shift began, he glanced briefly at the spot where James had placed the medal. It had been returned to him after the ceremony, but in his mind that place was sacred. The memory of that moment became part of his daily duty, adding a deeper meaning to his watch. Over time, Arlington began to notice something unusual. On every Veterans Day after that morning, small groups of people began leaving small tokens at the steps of the tomb. Flowers, flags, handwritten notes, and even small medals appeared quietly beside the marble. People who came to visit began to leave something in honor of those who had served, not for applause or recognition, but because they had been touched by the story they had seen. The tradition spread quietly. Veterans groups began to speak about it at meetings. Teachers began to tell their students. Families began to visit the tomb together, leaving quiet tributes. The small act of Colonel James Porter and Sergeant Michael Rivers had become something larger than themselves, a movement of remembrance and respect. James himself began to receive invitations to speak at veteran ceremonies across the country. He spoke in halls, at schools, at military gatherings. But he never wanted the speeches to be about him. He wanted them to be about something greater, the truth that had been shown that day. He said to every audience, that day was not about medals. It was about memory. It was about honoring those who can no longer stand before us. That medal belongs to all of us because honor belongs to everyone who remembers. Sergeant Rivers, too, was quietly recognized. Within his regiment, his actions became a story passed from one guard to another. They spoke about his choice as an example of courage in a different form. Courage not on the battlefield, but in the heart. The story continued to spread. It was shared quietly at first, then widely. Newspapers wrote about it. Veterans told their friends. Students wrote essays about it. People began to talk about what it meant to truly honor someone. Years later, Arlington National Cemetery had a quiet tradition on Veterans Day. A single bronze star was placed on the steps of the tomb of the unknown soldier. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a silent act of respect. It had become a symbol of humility and gratitude, a tradition born of one simple gesture. For James Porter, that became his legacy. He returned to Arlington many times. Each visit brought a quiet moment of reflection. He did not speak loudly of his action. He let it speak for itself. He knew that the medal and what had happened that day had found a place far greater than his own name. Sergeant Rivers continued his duty, standing guard through rain, sun, and snow. His steps remained perfect, but now they carried more than discipline. They carried meaning. Every step was a reminder that honor was something living, something passed from one soldier to another, from one generation to the next. Years later, students who had learned about that day still spoke of it in classrooms. Veterans still told the story quietly among themselves. Families still visited Arlington, leaving small tokens beside the tomb. And the words that Sergeant Rivers had spoken that morning, "Heroes don't leave honor behind, they share it," became something passed quietly from person to person, a message that continued to inspire. For those who had been there that day, part 5 of the story was not an ending. It was the beginning of something greater. It was proof that a single act of humility and respect could change hearts, inspire generations, and create a lasting tradition of honor. And so, under the quiet sky at Arlington National Cemetery, the tomb of the unknown soldier stands still. The guard marches in perfect silence, and on its marble steps a small bronze star rests, a simple object that carries the weight of courage, sacrifice, humility, and remembrance. It is a place where honor lives, not in medals or ceremonies alone, but in every quiet act that keeps memory alive. And that is the story of a day when a veteran dropped his bronze star, and a tomb guard's bold act stunned a nation, not because of the ceremony, but because it reminded everyone who witnessed it that true honor belongs to those who remember.